Welcome to I Am Nala podcast, brought to you by Nala Feminist Collective or Nala Fem, where we strive towards the liberation of African women and girls. We are a group of feminist leaders in politics and activism with a mission to foster, embolden, and mobilize women and girls from Africa and the diaspora for transformative change. I am your host, Hajer Sherif, founder of Nala Fem, and on this second season of I Am Nala podcast, we raise awareness during the 16 days of activism. We talk about Africa Young Women Beijing +25 Manifesto and its 10 demands. Today, our conversation will be about Demand 9 on silencing the guns, and who else to talk about the youth peace and security agenda than Hajer Sherif. She is a Libyan peace activist and one of UN Women 12 champions on women, peace and security and human rights. And she's also a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Congratulations, Hajer.
Thank you, Aya. Thank you for hosting me. And of course, I'm privileged and honored to be part of the group. And I'm very much looking forward to what we will be able to do together.
Absolutely. We're so thrilled to have you among these 17 badass women. And we want to know from you, Hajer, first of all, tell us in your own words, who is Hajer?
Well, this is it's a good question, yet a very difficult one, as you can imagine. If I would define myself or if I will share something about myself in a sentence, I'll say I'm a full-time activist. And full-time is not really the definition of the 9-to-5 job, but it's a 24/7. I wouldn't even call it a job, I'll call it a lifestyle. So I'm a full-time activist.
Like the saying, activism is your rent in this life.
Absolutely.
It's your full life. So tell us a bit your story. How did everything start for you? How did you get into the advocacy space? You do a lot of work at international level, but obviously you started with the community work and your cause is Libya. We all know that. But let's go a little bit back to your childhood, to how you grew up in a family that debates. And everyone knows your TED Talk about starting that conversation over the family table. So tell us your story.
Absolutely. I really like how you ask this question and trace it back to my childhood, because I think it's always important to discuss things, but also reflect on everything we do holistically. At least for me, I don't think I've done or I'm going to do anything that just comes to me out of the blue. It's all based on previous experiences, whether of my own or whether of people around me or people I know of. But I would say my activism started when I was really young, and it was one summer during the school holiday where me and my brother we were playing with our almost 10 cousins outside in our yard. We used to live in a family compound, which is a very conventional way for so many Libyan families to live. You live next to your uncles from your dad's side, your grandparents from your dad's side. So we were maybe around 10 cousins playing outside every day. And I remember one time my dad came to me and my brother and asked us to come into the house. And he said, from now on, we will start having weekly family meetings. And I very much remember at the time, I was like, what? Like, what is this, And perhaps I was also very, I wouldn't say pissed off, but, I wanted to go outside and play. So it didn't sound exciting at first, until my dad actually said, in these meetings, this will be your opportunity to criticize me and your mother, and we're not gonna hold it against you. We're not gonna tell you, remember that day you said this and this and that, or anything of within this line. And he sat us and he explained to us, and I remember all of us were like, okay, this sounds really cool, let's start doing it. And we started having these weekly meetings where we would literally discuss everything that's happening in the house, the regular events, so to say. But this was also an opportunity for me, my brother, my siblings in general, but also for my parents to bring up issues that happens in a very constructive way. So I remember a few times before the meeting, if there is me and my brother, for instance, if we would have a fight during a regular weekday, and we will threaten each other that, I'm going to bring this up in the family meeting, because then we know that we are going to be in a setting where he will have to listen and I will have to listen, and my parents are going to sit there being the judge. So personally, I would say perhaps I started my activism as a politician because I was literally at that age doing everything a politician would do. You argue your case, you go, you debate. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to compromise. And then maybe...
And how old were you there? How old?
Around 6, 7. It started around that age.
So that was a negotiation table, basically.
It was literally a negotiation table. To the extent it was formal and structured to an extent that we had someone taking notes. And at the end of every meetings, we had to sign that we agree, for an example, to the conclusion or the peace agreements me and my brother had. And you know what, Aya, 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, we were moving from our old house to a new one. And we were, emptying the library, and we found a pile of notebooks that dates back to more than 20 years ago, where, it's literally... It's just surreal to, like, for that moment, for me and my brother and my parents to sit and take a look at them, because we were like, oh my God, this was something that was so formal, so structured, to an extent that it was systematic engagement, right? And after I did the TED Talk, many people ask me, so where did your father think of this idea? And when I ask him, he says, well, because, Libya was under a regime where there was no civic engagement or political engagement. So sort of that was his way to provide an alternative to something, at least at the time, there was no alternative for. So this is how the whole story started, I'll say.
And did your father, how did he feel now that you are in peace building, peacemaking, negotiations? Did he think now that he had a hand in this, he grew this negotiation skill in you?
Absolutely. I would say absolutely. And of course, him and my mother, my parents both, I would say they do have the right to get credits for that, Of course, that was an experience that I had, but no one is able to do something only from one experience or one education course, so to say. Of course, I had to build up a lot. I had to work a lot on myself. But if my dad comes to me one day and says, I take the credit for that, I would agree for sure.
That's amazing. And so then Libya's revolution happened. And where were you back then? What were you doing? How did, this table of negotiation from the family move to the international space, to talking to the Security Council, talking to UN agencies, talking to stakeholders, European Union? How did it move from that young learning how to negotiate and have those conversations, and also the freedom, right? Because that table is safety for you, it's a safe space, and has the freedom to raise your issues. And now you're faced with reality. It's no more your dad and brother, it's heads of states and government.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think it's just important to explain that the timeline did not go from the family peace table to the international one. Actually, if you would ask me, perhaps many people now, if they look at my work or they see me speaking at an event or something, most probably it's going to be on an international level. But that's the only thing that's sort of it's the tip of the iceberg that people see. And also the fact that this started to happen, or my engagement with the international community, for me, it's very recent. And it's not, I started to focus more on that when I started to see the role that the international community plays on Libya. If you would ask me, I would definitely prefer a scenario where everything in Libya is Libyan-led, is led from the inside, it's led by Libyans, and then perhaps we wouldn't need to have really concrete and constructive and try to even advocate members of the international community, for an example, to ensure that Libyan women are part of peace negotiations, or to ensure that young people are part of peace negotiations. So it's very important for me to highlight that maybe this international engagement started to become more and more in the past 3 years, but I started my activism for peace and security in Libya since 2011. So we have around 6-7 years where almost all of my work was heavily focused only on Libya. And as I said, I only started paying attention to the role international community plays on Libya because of the role that they are actually playing, which is increasing by the time. But 2011, for me, my life is sort of divided between pre-2011 and post-2011, which is completely two different lives. When the revolution started in 2011, I was studying medicine at the time. And I must admit, I was heavily influenced by Grey's Anatomy. I watched the show. I thought this is a cool job. And I sincerely planned to become a doctor, as a surgeon, more particularly. And after high school, I enrolled in medical school. And I studied my first year. And then when I was studying my second year, actually we had a preparatory year and then a first year. And when I was doing my first year officially, the revolution started. And I remember at the time, it was a time of extreme uncertainty, but also extreme hope, And I think for many of us, little that we knew that the situation is going to escalate to an extent that it's going to become a war and a serial of armed conflicts. But I remember when it was August 2011, when the war finally reached Tripoli, my city. And at the time, because of the armed conflict, because of the fightings that were taking place in the streets, not all medical staff were able to reach the hospital. So the hospitals put out announcements for medical students who are in areas where they can access hospitals and clinics to volunteer. And that's what I did. I volunteered at the hospital in August 2011. And I remember the first day when I went to the hospital, I was like, this is not real, because of the fact that everything I've seen and heard of during the past months, so from February 2011 to August 2011, was highly focused on the revolution. Of course, it was also part of it was an armed revolution. So there was fightings between two groups. The international community, the NATO interfered. There was airstrikes. But, I would say we lived an extreme level of violence, yet we sort of endured it, and we were very tolerant towards it to an extent that no one really even was sort of self-critical to the fact that, okay, it's a revolution that we all support, but it's also a war. So as much as we're supporting a revolution, we should also be very prepared when the revolution ends or succeed to also deal with the leftovers of the war, And that's why my time at the hospital was very eye-opening, in the sense of, to give you an example, I've seen victims from airstrikes, which is something that was not reported in the news. No one spoke about them. Everyone spoke about the young men who gets injured because they are in the front lines. And for you sort of logically you would tell yourself, okay, if these people went to fight, they sort of, we all know the consequences, you know, the possibility that someone will get injured or killed is very high. So you approach it from a very it's very sad to say this, but pragmatic perspective. But this is not to say that it's justified. But then, as I said, when I went to the hospital, I was like, no, this war did not only affect people at the front lines, this war actually affected civilians who have most probably nothing to do even with the revolution. Perhaps they weren't even pro or against, you know. And that was the moment where I thought, okay, this was a revolution, it's great, but it's really time to work on the society, because we went through a war, we went through an extreme level of violence, the society was polarized, and it's the time to start doing something about it. And that's when I thought of co-founding the Together We Build It organization.
Yeah, I mean, when you say your life before 2011 and after, that speaks to me, because also, you know, as a neighbor of Libya, we were watching, and it was heartbreaking to see that the excitement for the revolution turned into a war, and we had refugees across the border. I've been there in June 2011. For about a month, we had 1 million refugees. So to see, as you said, that this is affecting civilians, affecting workers, not only Libyans, but even other Africans from across the continent who were migrants in Libya, that the picture then started to be depicted. And then you founded Extremely Together, and your focus became violent extremism. Why is that? Because the war in Libya has so many angles that you can work on peace building and peace and security, but you've chosen, let's focus on violent extremism.
So in 2011, I co-founded the Together We Build It organization, which is a Libyan NGO that is focused entirely on working on Libya and working on peace and security in Libya. So, for an example, ensuring and supporting women in peace building, young people in peace building, among other areas of our work. And then, so that was in 2011, and then in 2016, I joined the Extremely Together initiative, which was launched by the late Kofi Annan and the Kofi Annan Foundation. But your question is very important when it comes to violent extremism. I understand that, I recognize that violent extremism means different things to so many people. For me, when I say violent extremism, I'm literally talking about any form of extreme violence that has a motivation or that has an ideology. It can be a political ideology, it can be an ethnic ideology, it can be a religious ideology, it can be any sort of ideology. So for me, working on violent extremism in Libya, I know it means something different to someone, for an example, in the UK, or perhaps in Europe or in the US, because even the term violent extremism is also very romanticized, for an example, in the media by international politicians and world leaders, where the minute you say violent extremism, everyone sort of thinks of Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and sort of everyone neglects everyone else who some of them are also accused or within the groups of just having a mental disorder. For me, that's not the case. For me, as I said, violent extremism is any form of organized, structured, extreme violence that has a motivation and an ideology, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's very important to define or redefine, because, as you said, it has different understanding in different contexts. And then I want to move on now to focus on gender and you as a young female in this field. And I'm sure, you know, working from the community in Libya to going to the international stage, and it's a male-dominated space in general, the peace and security. But also it's justified by saying, you know, young men are the ones who get radicalized, and so it becomes really a main conversation. So how did you, or maybe like tell us some of the things you remember that were really surprising to you or shocking even that why am I treated like this? Why am I not heard in this field just because of my gender? And you know, during my tenure as the youth envoy, I always remember this moment with the head of state, where we had a bilateral meeting, and I had two men in my team. He had two men on his team. We were on a table, and he kept looking at them when talking to me. I kept talking to him passionately about what I was talking about, and then when he answers, he kept looking at them. And when I told my colleagues when we went out, they didn't even notice that. You know, it's an experience that only me can live it and see it, and they didn't even notice it. And later on, we reflected on it. So what were one of or two incidents that happened to you that you were like, this is happening to me just because of my gender in this field and because I'm a young female advocate in this field?
You know, it's very interesting, the example you gave, because I can bet it's the same example, even if the story or the details are a little bit different from one another, but in principle, it's the same approach that happens on a national level in Libya, for instance, but also on an international level. And I'm going to say something that I'm quite sure many members of the international community to Libya might disagree with, is the fact that, for an example, for me, sometimes it's much easier to have a conversation with the national actors than the international actors working in Libya. Because for the national actors, I would say, I'm not saying everyone is gender inclusive, everyone believes, all of them believe in the right of women to be part of, for example, peace processes, or even political processes more generally. Of course, I'm not going to make this claim. But when I'm discussing with national actors, I still have the card of saying, you know, I'm Libyan, same as you are, and I have citizenship rights the same as you do. So sort of the argument, whatever he do after that, it's sort of on his own personal beliefs, you know, it's someone acting on their own personal belief and not on the belief or the thinking of the whole system or the whole unit or the agency or whatsoever. But when it comes to members of the international community, it's completely something different, because it just feels that they come to a country like Libya sort of equipped with the toolbox of stereotypes, where they're like, you know, we've researched Libya, we watched few clips, we read policy briefs by not even Libyans, foreign experts who might have never went to Libya. They might have went to Libya shortly, but then, you know, like, the fact is they're not Libyans. They've never lived the experience which you referred to yourself, you know, the fact that you were sitting on the same table, but it was sort of an experience that was designed only for you as a young woman in that space. And I remember one time I was having a conversation with a mediator actor working in Libya. They're heavily involved with literally the highest level of negotiations in Libya. And I was discussing with them the fact that they had a meeting where they only invited men and they didn't invite a single Libyan woman. And I told them, well, it's when I look at what you're doing, I'm not seeing Libya. I'm seeing you, an international actor, literally applying your own stereotypes on what Libya looked like. And, you know, it was a very formal setting, an official meeting that supposedly everyone is going to have a constructive conversation. And then literally that the head of that international actor said, oh, you're so delusional. Like, you're literally delusional. You don't understand the reality on the ground. You're idealistic. And I was like, first of all, literally, you can never tell a Libyan you do not understand the reality on the ground, especially when you are not Libyan. Like, you can't say such a thing, because it's like, you see, this is the power dynamics between literally an external actor coming to me as a Libyan woman, which is something I've never heard them saying to a Libyan man, for instance. If they disagree with the Libyan man and their approach, they will just say, you know, it's a different thinking, or it's a different political thinking, or it's a different approach, it's still objective. Their disagreement with Libyan men, it's very objective. But when it comes to me, but also other Libyan women, it's always very personalized on the gender. Like the fact that I'm sitting in a meeting talking about how peace negotiations should happen in Libya, and also talking about an example where this external actor single-handedly excluded Libyan women from a meeting, and to be described delusional, idealistic, and not realistic, and not understanding the reality on ground, because of course the male expert in front of me who's not Libyan, who he goes to Libya, but sorry, at the end of the day, you can never tell a Libyan you don't understand the reality on the ground, because this is my home, this is my country, I'm the expert here. If we're gonna play the game of who's the expert, take it or leave it. You could be doing mediations for 100 years. When you're talking about peace and security in Libya, I'm still the expert, and your role is to support my work, my vision. And of course, when I'm saying I'm not talking about me as a person, but the Libyan vision and the Libyan needs of how to do things, not to be called delusional and idealistic.
Absolutely. I think your example is really demonstrates what we ask international community when we say, do your work in equal partnership, do your work in consultation, do your work in, it's that. And then you find so many of these examples where it's a complete opposite, and it's sad to see after more than 2 decades of advocacy about inclusion, and still we see just ticking boxes, just sit there but don't talk, because whatever you say is idealistic. That's outraging.
And delusional. If it was
delusional.
Idealistic, maybe you can take that in for a second, but to be called delusional, that's a little bit
yeah. So a lot of amazing Libyan women, we've seen them rise, especially at first during the revolution, after the first transition, where we have seen things moving ahead. But then, unfortunately, many of them either passed away or went outside of Libya. But even before the revolution, I just want to know from you and people who are listening to us, who are the Libyan women that have been erased from these processes, that we don't see their names, whether in the region, as a Tunisian, as a neighbor, or even an international community, because we all know that history is also written in a male perspective, that only the liberation movement were men, only in the 90s there were the men, but the women always not recognized, not documented.
This is the story of Libya, this is the story of Africa, this is the story of other places where women do the work, but then they don't get to do the talk, and the talk that is broadcasted, the talk that is documented, the talk that is written in history books, as you said, but also not only the talk in the sense of having speeches and standing in or signing peace agreements or decrees or whatsoever, not doing the talk where, if you look at Libya, peace building is happening really on the local level and on the national level, not the official one, so to say. And this is not to discredit the efforts from national decision makers or national officials to do national reconciliation, for instance. But this is, so to say, if you look at the past 10 years, the fact is almost the work that is official on the national level, every time there was a conflict, it will be disrupted. Every time something goes wrong, if a new minister change, then the whole work sort of changes. If there is any distress or any change or any conflict, the work on the national level, the official level, stops. However, if you look at literally from 10 years ago until this day, the work on the local level still continues regardless of how difficult it is, and regardless of how polarized it is. You know, I remember in 2018, there was an international political talks that was organized on Libya in Palermo in Italy. And it was the Italian government, it was the UN mission to Libya who was literally designed, facilitate, and, you know, planned the whole party, so to say, from A to Z. And before that, there was the same political talks that happened in Paris. Of course, it was hosted by France. And when you look at the photo, you only see 4 Libyan men. And you sort of question yourself. You're like, but this is not, if you walk out in the street in Libya, you're never going to see only men on the street. So this is not a representation of, quote, the reality on the ground that our friends say, I don't understand or I don't know, right? So when there was no women in the conference in France, we decided that, okay, we're never going to allow that to happen again in Italy. And we started advocating to the Italian government, to the UN, to the international actors, to the national actors, that they need to ensure that women are part of these negotiations and dialogue. And I remember we had a meeting with, now he's a former official, it was the prime minister at the time, where we were asking him as an organization that he needs to ensure that women are part of his delegation. And I remember one of the arguments to strengthen that, you know, we as women and young women really play a crucial role for peace building on the ground. We said, as an organization, we can literally hold and organize, for an example, a meeting, a training, an activity in the different parts of the country, in the West, in the East, and in the South. And you as a prime minister, you cannot do that, because while you can organize an activity, for an example, in the west of Libya, you cannot do anything in the east of Libya because it's not under your control. And this is just an example that illustrates that on the ground, women and young people are the ones who are still, literally in the case of Libya, for an example, keeping the society together, while the ones on the official level are polarized to an extent that they don't speak to each other, they didn't speak to each other, they cannot even travel to meet each other. And we, the women and the young people, are still the one, regardless of how horrible the situation is, we're still the one who are able to travel the country, to connect the country together.
Absolutely. I want to, since we don't have much time, I want to have 2 more questions. One on the manifesto. So Hajer, you signed and endorsed the Africa Young Women Beijing +25 manifesto, especially demand 9 on silencing the guns. And we know the African Union had, you know, a whole flagship project on silencing the guns. But how do we achieve that? We've been calling on the Security Council, calling on the AU Peace and Security Council. We've been developing the Women Peace and Security Resolution, Youth Peace and Security Resolution. I mean, the policy level is already has the foundation for this to happen, but it's not happening on the ground. In your vision, in the work and the experience you've had the past decade and even before, how do you think we can achieve silencing the guns? How can we silence those guns?
One important thing is that it's time for us to get political. For those who can become official politicians, please do so. Bring the experience and all the efforts you've done in mobilizing, understanding the issue, connecting, talking to women and young people, bring all of that experience to the official level. So try to get yourself into an office as soon as possible. Everyone else who's listening to us and who have the ability, and I must say the privilege actually, to perhaps take up such role. And the reason I'm saying we need to get political, because Aya, as you know, if we look at the peace and security agenda, the global one more generally, and then we look at the women peace and security agenda, the youth peace and security agenda, the current prevention agenda, for instance, for me, I can clearly see a pattern of romanticizing some elements of these agendas. So to say, whenever we're talking about young people, they will easily tell you, the role young people play is on social media. We're going to give you funding to do a social media campaign. If you say that, if you agree to that, you're going to be supported almost by everyone. But if you would say until this day that, no, we're saying that alongside supporting us to do, for an example, a social media campaign, we also need to be sitting on the peace negotiations, sort of that's the area that no one can touch, because I would say for many decision makers, including international ones, when we're talking about formal peace, the peace is literally made and agreed on and discussed by officials or armed groups, for instance, or leaders of armed groups, then that's a completely different story than sort of the other work that we are discussing. And that's why I'm saying get political, because we need to bridge the gap between the soft peace and security approach, the hard peace and security approach, and make them one. The only way to do that, I think we gave a chance for so many of the groups who are currently leading the development of these agendas. And it's honestly time for women and young people to actually start being on the other side of the table in order for us to ensure that these two agendas are bridged. Otherwise, I'm not going to say I'm pessimistic, but I'm afraid we're still going to continue doing the exact same thing, right? Investing so much in the side that is romanticized, where everyone is saying, play your role in peace building on your own. It's like giving a kid the game and telling. And I think it's time for us to say, no, we don't want the toys anymore. We want to sit on the official table and have the same conversations and have the same influence that the other groups are having.
Oh, you were frozen for a bit, but I can see you now. I'm 100% with you. We must be on the other side of the table, not the one listening and ticking a box, but the one really making decisions. But do you think we're going to make the difference? Because we are also products of these regimes. We're products of this culture. We're products of all these broken systems. Do you think if we are in those spaces, in the power that we want to hold, we can make a difference as a generation? Or what is different about us to actually silence the guns and say and take those tough decisions?
Aya, my expectation is, if I see a woman or if I see a young person working in peace and security, doing any sort of work to advance and promote peace in their local communities on a national level, but also on an international level, my expectation is that if you say that you're doing something and you want something, then you're gonna carry that wherever you go, right? And that's why when you first, in the beginning of our chat, you asked me how you define yourself or who are you? I said I'm a full-time activist, because honestly speaking, and this goes to us activists, young women and other groups, if you say you stand for something, then you should stand for the same thing, regardless of where you go, regardless of what's your title, what's your job capacity, or in what level you're working. Now, I totally agree with you. Sometimes if the system is broken, if you join the system, you might not be able to change. But I think it's important to try, but it's also important when you're failing or if you're not able to do something, is to come out and say, well, I was not able to do 1, 2, 3 because of this challenge, this challenge, this challenge. Because for us to be out of the system and say the system is broken, my question is, what is broken about the system? Let's make a list of what is not working. And the only way for us to really know exactly what is not working is perhaps for us to be part of it, try to make it work. If it's much harder and much difficult for us to actually change it, then it will be our role to come out in a very transparent way and tell everyone what were the exact challenges we faced.
Absolutely. And I look forward to you also running for office once we have a transition, a solid transition to take Libya to a different direction. I want you to inspire many of the young women and girls who look up to you and aspire to be, Hajer, whether in your work, in the community, in Libya, in your own country, or at the international level. So, what would you tell them? What would you advise them? Based on what you've experienced during your journey, what would you maybe tell your younger self to do, or maybe you would keep it the same? So they're listening to you and they want to hear from you one or two advice.
Well, if I can give an advice to myself, sometimes I say maybe I should have continued watching Grey's Anatomy and continued in medical school and become a doctor, because I think to actually inspire someone, I should also be honest. This work is very difficult. It is extremely difficult. Sometimes you will feel you're doing the right thing. Sometimes you will feel you're making a change. But there's also many other times where you feel helpless, especially in situations where you face people who don't understand you, who don't understand your cause, and for some reason they have upper hand in what can be done than yourself. But for me, I would say the only reason, and it's a very fundamental one that keeps me going, is actually knowing that I'm doing the right thing. And I'm doing the right thing not only in the sense of this is a duty and responsibility. If you are aware of something, for example, if you're walking down the street and you see a house set on fire and you're hearing people screaming inside, you're not going to just say, well, it's not my house, and continue. I mean, if you do such a thing, sorry speaking, you must be a very horrible person to have the gut to see a house set on fire, to see people stuck inside, and still walk away and say, well, it's not my house. This is how I'm approaching peace building in Libya, security in Libya, but also gender equality, injustices all over the place. Because I truly believe that the only difference between someone like me, someone else, for example, another Libyan, and someone who's having a really tremendous, great life in another country is luck. The difference between us and them, and I would say them, those who perhaps are not struggling with severe issues, same as us, or for example, continents around the world who are not having it as difficult as Africa, for an example, is to say that the only difference between us and them is luck. And the way to change it is to really do something about it. You might not succeed yourself, but at least at the end of the day, you just need to understand that this is your right. If you give it up, then you're the one to blame.
Thank you so much, Hajar, for your honesty and for sharing with us your experience, a little bit of your personal story. I mean, you summarized it for us, but there is a lot to unpack there. And thank you for all you do for your country, and keep up the fight. It's a long road. It's not easy, but also a lot of activists across the continent are supporting your cause and want to see a peaceful Libya. So thank you again for being with us, and all
Thank
the
you.
best.
Yeah. Thank you. And before you end, I also want to hear from you. What advice would you give?
What advice would I give? Oh, I'm the host.
You
I'm
give.
not. I'm not. I'm the host here. But I
Probably
I
have a
I I
give us
always,
one.
yeah, I always tell. I do a lot of mentoring, and I always tell. It's not really about the political situation. I think it starts from your identity and your mission, and waking up every morning, and driving yourself out of your bed sometimes to do what you do because you love it. And I think that goes back to finding your radical self.
Absolutely.
Just your power is your radical self. You have to find it and live it every day, whether that is to be a politician, to be a peace advocate, to be just a mom, whatever it is that you want to do in your life, just find it and do it with all the power you have.
Absolutely. That's great advice. I'll take it myself as well, just so you know.
Amazing. And I really look forward to you continuing to work with Nala and, being the face and voice of the collective. We are very proud of the work you do.
Same here, of course. I'm very much looking forward as well. And congratulations once again, Aya. And see you soon.
Absolutely. Come to Tunis.
Absolutely.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
You were listening to I Am Nala podcast. Check out nalafem.org/sign to learn more about our manifesto. Subscribe and see you in the next episode.